today's speaker is Martha Braun. She is the project manager at the Oyster Gardening and Restoration for the Coalition to Save Hempstead Harbor. And we are looking forward to learn how oyster can help restore our waters, provide habitats, and support marine biodiversity. And it is a type of community gardening, Martha. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you how it's gardening. It's probably a little different than some of you guys are familiar with, but we're gonna keep calling it gardening. It's too late now. So yeah, thank you to Rewild Long Island. And yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and talk more about this program and share some information about the coalition for those of you who maybe aren't so familiar with us and the work that we've been doing for this program over the last couple of years. So yeah. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with the Coalition as an organization, we are a nonprofit environmental organization that was founded in 1986. We participate in policy and planning. We run a variety of educational and outreach programs. And we also have a really rigorous water quality monitoring program that's been going on for the last 30 years. So yeah, none of these things that we do, and that doesn't even encompass it all, but none of them are very small feats. And I definitely encourage you to check out our website if you want to get more familiar with our work more broadly. I believe the link to our website will be posted in the chat for anyone to see. So that's a great resource for anyone to find out more. And I think we have some other coalition folks here today. Just this team is really what makes it happen. I think Carol's here, Michelle, Sarah, Lisa, all these people who are part of our staff and all of our collaborators that help get this work accomplished. And before I get into the presentation, also you'll be able to see on our website, quick announcement about our activities is that we host a beach cleanup every year as part of the International Coastal Cleanup. This year it is on September 30th, so this coming Saturday from 9 to 11. And we'll be at 4 different beaches around Hempstead Harbor. That'll be Town North Hempstead Beach Park, Tappan Marina, Seacliff Beach, and Morgan Beach in Glen Cove. Coalition staff and volunteers will be there, and we'll be cleaning up debris and weighing the material as part of a larger international effort to understand marine pollution better. So if you're interested in participating in that, I have to squeeze the announcement in. Check out the flyer that's on the homepage of our website, and you can RSVP by messaging the email that's on that flyer. It should be RSVP at the coalition to save hempsteadharbor.org. Okay, I definitely recommend you guys come. I definitely recommend you check out our other work as well. But this presentation is about community oyster gardening and really what we've been able to construct over the last 2 years through this program. So for anyone who isn't super familiar or hasn't participated in the program, community oyster gardening is essentially an education and restoration program where community members, individuals, families, students, they gather down at a certain location where we are raising oysters for a summer before they get released into local waters for the benefit of the environment. So for water quality improvement and habitat restoration. It is a really community-run effort. And yeah, it's a conservation education program is what we like to call it. Okay, so we've structured our program around 3 major goals. The first one is education, and I would say this kind of intersects every other activity that goes on in the program. It is a huge priority for us, not only through, presentations like this, but mainly really through the hands-on work that volunteers do that I'll be able to describe to you. We try to really foster a connection with the local waters, and that's where so much of the valuable education comes in. Just like a lot of Rewild's programs, it's getting kind of involved directly with your hands and seeing an impact, in both the short and long term, working with a group of people that makes that education so valuable. The other 2 goals are habitat restoration and water quality improvement, and we also keep those in mind throughout the program and how we structure it. So those are always in the back of our mind. And this program is relatively new, like I might have mentioned. We started it last year, and this is how we've decided to design it. So just for a little more context, we have oyster gardens, is what I guess we would call them, which are essentially just sites where the oyster cages are and where the volunteers meet up to raise the oysters at 4 different locations around Hempstead Harbor. In your upper left on the slide, that is Seacliff Yacht Club. On the upper right, we have the Hempstead Harbor Club. At those 2 locations, it's member-based, so we keep them at the boating clubs and members participate in maintaining them. We also, in your lower right, that's an image from Tappan Marina in the town of Oyster Bay. And the last picture in the lower left is our newest site at North Hempstead Beach Park. We just added it this year, so that makes it a harbor-wide program, which is something we're so proud to have accomplished. It really expanded our reach to more volunteers. It really, is essentially what made this presentation able to happen, and the connection with Rewild. So it's been great to expand to that location as well. So that's where we are right now. That's where we host our oyster gardens. And the garden is obviously so different than what you guys all think of when you think of a garden. It really, like I said, just means that the cages, which are always floating in the water, are strung either alongside a dock or between some moorings where they're constantly submerged in water, and oysters are the things that's growing instead of a vegetable or a flower. So where the volunteers meet, what they do is they have 2 objectives, essentially. The first objective is to clean off the cages. That's kind of the dirty work of it all. So this occurs from July through September. The volunteers will go down to the docks on a either weekly or bi-weekly basis, depending on the amount of volunteers and the kind of requirements of the site. But the volunteers work in teams. So using different equipment that we provide, like hoses that we set up and scrub brushes, the volunteers work to get fouling off of the cages. So fouling is just the accumulation of organic matter, and it's specifically called biofouling if we start to see live organisms that will attach themselves to our equipment. And this is the same kind of thing you'll see if you happen to be looking at the bottom of a boat or a bulkhead. Anything that's sitting in the marine environment for an extended period of time, especially as the waters get warmer over the course of the summer, will start to attract things that settle on hard surfaces. And what we have to do is clean the cages in order to ensure that there is proper water flow to all the oysters inside. So the picture on the left, there are oysters in there, and they're just kind of, they've been covered in sediment. So we tend to kind of rinse the oysters off too. Every time that we meet down at the docks, the volunteers remove all the oysters from the cages so that they have better access to all the kind of crevices of the cages to clean them. The oysters require that proper water flow to feed, which is why we keep them in those cages with like relatively large holes. And yeah, they can get quite covered very quickly. We put them in the water and they're pristine, and then in a matter of a few weeks, everyone's kind of shocked at how dirty they get. So that's why the team effort is very helpful. Everything gets done fairly quickly, but like I said, especially when the waters get warmer, life finds a way. Things are attracted to the cages and cover up those holes that we really want to be open so that the oysters are thriving and they're able to feed more effectively. We see other kinds of colonizing organisms too. So just a few examples, bryozoans, they kind of look plant-like, but they're other invertebrate species. Those I saw last year on the floats of the cages a lot. This year we saw a lot of slipper snails, which is something you might see just the shells of on the beach when those are all stacked on top of each other. And organisms like this, they can, like I said, block the cages. They can also take up space on the shells where the oysters themselves are growing, the young oysters. So we try to minimize biofouling by cleaning the cages every other week. The volunteers obviously play a huge role in that. This is what it looks like. This is early in the season. So like I said, those cages look pristine. Then they start to get more and more dirty as the season goes on. But that's why we have the volunteers, So The second objective is to measure the oysters. Having a lot of volunteers means that we have a lot of hands on deck for this as well. We have the volunteers work in pairs. One person will measure the oysters with a caliper and one person will record the measurements. And we just have the volunteers measure a sample of 20 oysters during each session. I encourage them to go for random sampling, not pick the largest ones they see, not pick the smallest ones they see, but a representative sample. Then I end up taking the averages of them. And what this tells us is kind of how they're doing over time. Like I said, this program runs from July through September. When we initially receive the oysters and place them in their cages, they can be as small as 5 to 10 millimeters, barely recognizable, very tiny. And by the end of the season, a lot of them are over 3 centimeters or 30 millimeters. So most of them have tripled in size. Every week the volunteers come, they notice a visual difference. And the actual measurements can help us do comparisons from site to site and comparisons just over time. And now we're also working kind of from year to year. So we're able to kind of get a picture of the health of the oysters in a broader way than just our other observations, and continue to learn and make improvements to the program if necessary. So yeah, the volunteers also play a huge role in gathering necessary information for us about the oysters. And the volunteers, like I said, the educational component is so pervasive. While they're doing these tasks, they are really learning about environmental stewardship. They're fostering a really direct connection with their local waters because they're raising the oysters. We're telling them exactly what's happening to the oysters. They're going to be released for habitat restoration and water quality purposes. So I also encourage the volunteers when they're down at the docks to make note of their surroundings, make note of the other organisms they're seeing, the appearance of the water, the weather, any sort of observations that kind of make you more aware of your general surroundings, and more aware that we're not just working with oysters. That's like the crux of our program, but oysters are part of this really intricate marine ecosystem. And we're giving volunteers the opportunity to see them at a phase in their life that is not a time where most people have access to them. So you're witnessing this really kind of unique development. And that's really where I think most of the educational components come in. So I want to talk a little bit about the other goals of the program being habitat restoration and water quality improvement. So the eastern oyster, which is the species that we're working with, was once very, very abundant in Hempstead Harbor, in other Long Island Sound bays, and all throughout the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast where it is native to. And like I said, this is the species that we utilize for the restoration program. It is the only species of oyster that is native to this area. Over the course of the 20th century, mainly due to a variety of factors, a few being overharvesting and water quality degradation, the oyster populations they plummeted pretty badly. So there's a lot of efforts currently being implemented to restore these populations because of their ecological importance. So the eastern oyster is what's known as a keystone species in its particular environment, which just means that it exerts this disproportionate influence on marine in biodiversity, in this case, marine biodiversity. So just for being one organism, it hosts and supports an incredible array of life, and it can really change the way that the marine ecosystem looks, whether it's there or whether it's not. So that's why it's called a keystone species. It exerts that very specific sort of hold on an ecosystem that can change. It's the biodiversity in an ecosystem, the abundance of the organisms. So before we even release the oysters, we tend to see a lot of life attracted to the cages. Volunteers are kind of pointing things out all the time, and just like constantly things are kind of dropping out of the cages as we pull them out of the water each session. And so, I mean, here are a few examples. We see crabs a lot. Crabs can prey on oysters, but a lot of them don't get inside the cages. That's another reason we have the cages, is to kind of protect them from predation. We saw a lot of eels this year. And we also see a lot of these little guys called skillet fish, which I love to point out to people because it's a great example of a organism that cohabitates on an oyster reef. And I don't know if, maybe this was really silly. I don't know if you guys noticed that there was a skillet fish in the other photo. It's supposed to be camouflage. Maybe it was a surprise, maybe it was so obvious, but skillet fish have a particular coloration that enables them to hide really well on oyster reefs. They sit there and attach themselves to oysters with their mouths, but they do not harm the oysters in any way. They feed on other small worms and crustaceans that also tend to populate in those spaces. So they thrive on oyster reefs. I had never personally seen one before we started doing this program. So, and now I see them all the time. You know, we see them from the very beginning of the program to when they're, you know, larger like this. They can be very tiny. And then when we release them, we just see them all the time, which is very encouraging. It's like, again, I like to point out to volunteers because it really is, it's such a concrete example of what we're trying to do here. The oysters that we're repopulating have this ability to support life in this disproportionate way. And they're so important to Hempstead Harbor and to all the places that they are native to. Okay, so oyster larvae are actually free floating in the water column for about 2 weeks before they settle somewhere. So we're working with a form of oyster called spat on shell. Like when I mentioned before that when we receive the oysters and they're 10 millimeters, some of you might have been wondering how they fit in those cages with those big holes. So the oysters themselves are very tiny, but they settle onto a hard surface. In our case, this process occurs under controlled conditions at a hatchery. So oyster larvae are free floating and then they attach themselves to old shells and they settle there for the rest of their lives. And even though this occurs in the kind of spring season before they're delivered to us and we distribute them to our sites in the form of what's called spat on shell. I don't know if I got that term directly in there, but that's what it's called. It's called spat on shell. Yeah, so this happens in a hatchery, but it mimics what we tend to see out in the wild and what you might have heard as oyster reefs. When oysters spawn and you have that high density of them and they're all kind of like stacked on each other, that's what's known as an oyster reef. And so they tend to settle on each other. See if I have a good picture. So here, this is a good kind of depiction of spat on shell at the beginning of the program versus the end of the program. So I'm not going to lie to you, these aren't the same exact shell, but it still gives you a good idea. So you start out, all of those little yellowish specks are oysters. And I hope this kind of emphasizes that, again, this is not something we typically get to see. Volunteers are often very surprised to hear that those are oysters. And then by the end of the program, a lot of them, like I said, maybe triple in size. And it ends up looking something like the photo on the right, which is from just last week when we were releasing these oysters. And I think hopefully this image gives you a good idea, in addition to that one with the skillet fish in it, of how all of these cracks and crevices that start to form have the ability to support a lot of life. So as the oysters continue to grow and mature, the eastern oyster can get to be 3.5+ inches, so even much bigger than they are in that photo on the right. All of those spaces within them in an oyster reef and in clumps of oysters like this provide protection to a lot of marine juvenile species. It gives them a better chance of surviving predation in a really early, vulnerable stage of their life. So that's one of the reasons why oyster reefs and even restored reefs have been shown to have the ability to encourage biodiversity, so and general abundance of marine organisms. So I hope that seeing that structure kind of gives you an idea of why these are such kind of crucial organisms. Again, it's not really the way we might be used to seeing oysters, but if you were to just find oysters in the wild, this is what they look like. They grow on top of each other. They grow in clumps, and the spat-on shell that we receive for this program does the same thing, which is what makes it such a beneficial choice for restoration programs like this one. So why do we even care about biodiversity? You know, it's mentioned in context beyond marine ecosystems. Obviously, we care about it in every ecosystem. Biodiversity influences in a positive way the resilience of an ecosystem, or how well it can respond to environmental changes. So in a world where we are facing a myriad amount of environmental changes, higher amounts of biodiversity can help an ecosystem respond and adapt to those changes. So by trying to bolster the population of the eastern oyster here in Hempstead Harbor, and ideally over time, encouraging that return of marine biodiversity, encouraging juvenile fish species to, you know, find those areas where we're restoring the oysters, we are hoping to create a more resilient environment overall, and return it to some semblance of what it used to be. So, yeah. Here's another photo of what the oysters look like on their release day. They look quite different than when, you know, we receive them. And I guess I wanted to emphasize with this again, how important the volunteers are in this process. So the raising of the oysters is a huge, you know, reason why the program is so successful for the restoration goal. So all the education, all the hands-on work that goes on with the volunteers down at the docks gets the oysters to looking how they look in this photo. Like I said, they're about 3 centimeters, so they're nowhere near their like mature size. But once they make it to this size, they are, you know, less susceptible to disease. They're less susceptible to predation. When we release them, they are more likely to survive because they're, you know, less likely to be buried in mud. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the work of the volunteers helps us ensure that we have more positive restoration outcomes, basically getting them from those tiny little spat that you saw to these larger clumps of oysters over the course of really just a summer. Yeah, so it's not just educational, but it's very practical as well. And this is what it looks like when we are working to release the oysters. So this is an image from, I would say this is just about from one of our sites out of 4. This was on one of the days where we were releasing them. This year, when all was said and done, we had a total of, I think, 28 cages across the 4 sites. And that would be, you know, this is a big approximation. As you could see with the spat-on shell, it's kind of hard to say exactly. It's impossible actually to say how many oysters there are, but it was approximately 60,000 oysters in total between the 4 sites. So we had to take 2 days of work to gather all of them up, empty out the cages, and release the oysters into their designated conservation management area. So I'll tell you a little bit about that as well. So the conservation management area is an area that we got approved by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, where we're able to, like I said, take these oysters out on the boat and gingerly sort of dump them over the edge, say a quick little goodbye. And that's where they will reside for the rest of their lives. So not only is this area DEC approved, but we also chose it specifically for its characteristics and for its ability to continue to support these oysters in the best way possible. The main characteristic being that the area below where this dumping is occurring, the bottom is more sandy than it is muddy. In Hempstead Harbor and in a lot of other places, this can shift depending on where you are. So we were able to use previous sediment surveys and do our own testing to determine that the bottom where we were dumping these oysters into, where they were going to live for the rest of their lives, is more sandy and more coarse. And so oysters have a preference for that sort of habitat because they're less likely to sink into the mud. Sinking into the mud would mean probably death for a lot of the oysters. So when they're on a harder surface, they are more likely to survive. So we chose that intentionally. Last year, we dumped 15,000 of our oysters that were raised in the program into this conservation management area. And what we do is we leave them there for a while, but then we make sure that we also check in on them. Luckily, we have a great partnership with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Suffolk County. They're actually the ones, their marine hatchery provides us with our spat on shell. And in April of this year, we took them out on a boat and they did dives down to locate the oysters that we released from last year's program. So the oysters that were raised with the 2022 group of volunteers. And that's what you're seeing on the screen right now. And they managed to find some. They pulled them up and they were basically doing more measurements. So again, the measurements coming in handy, we were able to see how much they had grown since they were released, since we got them. We're able to do all sorts of comparisons. And the divers were also checking for any signs of predation. Another thing that we can kind of assess as we go forward and try to, make sure that we're still putting these oysters in the best location possible for their continued growth and survival. And I'm sure you'll notice that these oysters, it's kind of hard to see, but they did grow a lot since we released them. I would say, they were between like 50 and 70 centimeters as opposed to say 30. So these are, healthy and thriving oysters that we released last year. And they found minimal signs of predation. So we were able to get further confirmation that the area we chose is a great place to continue putting them. And that's really what we did. Like I said, we put 60,000 more in the conservation management area this year. And yeah, we're gonna continue to monitor their progress on a yearly basis to make sure that, we're doing this in the most optimal way possible. So I want to talk a little bit about oysters and water quality to kind of start to wrap things up. I think the first thing a lot of people think of when it comes to oyster gardening programs and oyster restoration in general is water quality improvement. And like I said, that's certainly one of our goals. So oysters, they're known as filter feeders, and I don't need anyone to memorize this diagram. Basically, what oysters do is they take in water indiscriminately. On their gills, they have these tiny little things called cilia that can actually sort particles, what they want to eat and what they want to expel. So what they want to eat includes things like algae, other microorganisms, and what they don't want to eat, like nobody would want to eat, is sand and dirt, and they expel the sand and dirt, leaving the surrounding water filtered. So this is important for a lot of reasons, and it's another one of the services that oysters are able to provide in an ecosystem. So by being a really effective filter feeder, an adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. That's the general estimate. That's the number that's typically given, which is a lot of water. So by doing that, by taking algae out of the water column, they are helping to restore balance in what can increasingly become an imbalanced ecosystem. So what I mean by that is that we often have too much algae in the water, and this is fueled by nitrogen inputs. And a lot of times, it's an issue all over the place. Long Island Sound certainly deals with nitrogen inputs that are just too much, often referred to as nitrogen pollution. But I think that can confuse the issue a little bit. It's not really pollution. Nitrogen is totally necessary in the environment, and it's for plant growth. It's a nutrient just like it is for plants, for terrestrial plants. But in excess, it can cause large amounts of growth, too much growth, considered blooms if it gets to be at a really high level where you're really visually noticing that algae in the water. Either way, too much nitrogen, too much algae, Oysters play a role in filtering the water by taking in that algae, incorporating nitrogen into their own tissues. And the reason this is important, why we even care about there being too much algae in the water, it's not just, like aesthetic purposes. Algae is, they're composed of a variety of organisms. They're living things. And when they die and decompose, when you have these large blooms that are decomposed, that uses up oxygen. The decomposition process just uses up oxygen. So low DO, low dissolved oxygen, negatively impacts a variety of marine species. And we see this, every year here in Hempstead Harbor, every season, and it's similar to plenty of places here around Long Island Sound and all over coastal waters. You often see a seasonal dip in dissolved oxygen, and that's due to a variety of factors. It is by no means just fueled by nitrogen and algae and these sorts of imbalances, but certainly these cycles of blooms and decompositions can negatively influence dissolved oxygen levels. So basically what oysters do by filtering the water just by feeding, which is what they're doing already, is helping to restore balance to a potentially imbalanced ecosystem. They're native to here, this is the role that they play. So by restoring them, we're just putting them back and letting them do what they would normally do. So that's the deal with oysters and water quality. So I think I'll start to wrap up a little bit and just talk about kind of the summary and future outlook for this program. So here's a nice photo of some of the crew, some of our team and volunteers. This is from when we were releasing the oysters the other day. So this program started just last year. We were able to double in size in so many different areas. We more than doubled the amount of volunteers we were reaching and that were participating. We doubled the amount of spat on shell that we were raising. We added a new site. We got, at this point we have about 75,000 approximately oysters in our conservation management area. And, we've just been able to reach more people and continue these important partnerships and collaborations. That picture on the left are staff from Cornell Cooperative Extension on the day of delivery, and then another picture of some of our staff and volunteers on the release day. So many people come together to make this program happen. It really continues to astound me. And the program goes beyond just the volunteer season as well. The volunteers are like a crucial element. But we start planning for the next season the moment that this season ends, really. We have to do material prep, and the cages that you saw throughout this presentation, those are all built by volunteers that come beforehand and make up for any deficit we have in cages. The cages are reused every year, to be clear about that. But if we are expanding, which we did this year, we had to build more cages. So that has to happen before the season even begins. Anyone who signs up for the program goes through a orientation presentation where they learn about the oysters and hear a lot of the information that you all heard tonight about their life cycle and about, their health and their importance to the ecosystem. Because, at the end of the day, we are handling live organisms and we want to ensure that people are being as responsible as possible with them. So that happens beforehand. Then the volunteers come and they do all this incredible work, and then there's the release and the monitoring, and then it kind of starts over. So the program is definitely not restricted to the summer season. Work is going into it, all year long. And what's been so great about that is that we've just been able to reach, more people through this work. So continuing to make sure people, whether it's through directly participating in the program or just kind of tangentially experiencing it, are kind of being made aware about the ecological importance of this species. And yeah, I mean, here is, I mentioned, I don't know if I did actually, we have a variety of volunteers. We have individuals, families. This is a corporate team. Paul has a green team. This year, obviously we were able to partner with the wonderful Rewild Long Island interns who did such a fabulous job, and the organization of it. It was such a pleasure to have them join us. So, and everyone, we have, like I said, students, families, volunteers, of all kinds, and there's such a direct connection between the work that they do and the positive outcomes that we see at every year when we're doing our sort of check-ins. So I definitely wanted to emphasize that. Really wonderful stuff. So if anyone wants to find out more, I do recommend, again, going to our website. We have a page that's dedicated to our habitat restoration efforts. Specifically, we started to kind of provide you can find a lot of good photos and stuff on this page, which is our like oyster gardening updates page. I just would, write some periodic posts about how the program was going, the growth of the oysters. I think you'll get to, an even better view of how the program progresses throughout the season. And that'll be there, for whoever wants to look at it. And yeah, I mean, the coalition relies broadly on community support, so it is so important that we get this sort of engagement. And yeah, I don't think I missed anything, but I'm here to answer any questions. I think that is where I'm going to call it for now.
Thank you, Martha.
Absolutely.
So Elizabeth has a question.
Yes, I
do
got
oysters grow their own shell?
Yes. That's a great question. Yeah, oysters do grow their own shell. So unlike some other organisms that might come across one, oysters kind of pull minerals out of the seawater and use it to create their shells. They produce them on their own and slowly grow them over time.
So they actually extract the calcium out of the water and start growing it in.
Yeah, it's like how we, how any other organism might grow. It uses the nutrients that it obtains through its environment.
Wow. And I was watching and learning about oyster for this program, and I learned an interesting fact that an oyster can be both male and female, or they were male first and then female.
Yeah, so they can be hermaphroditic. So it's actually like sequentially hermaphroditic is the term. They all, they can change at various points in their lives, and that can fluctuate based on like environmental conditions. Yeah, and they switch back and forth depending on kind of the phase of their lives that they're in. So that's definitely correct. It's very interesting.
So it is very important that these oysters are attached to each other, because it's a closed space where they are able to fertilize, because they are not just release it into the
and I'm forgetting the number now, which is so bad, but a female oyster will release hundreds of millions of eggs when it does end up spawning, and obviously not all of those are going to get fertilized, which is why they release so many. They're just kind of expelled into the water column, hope that they get fertilized, and then if they do get fertilized, the larvae has to make it to a safe place. There are so many things that are barriers to its survival, so that's why they release so many, and it's better if they are close together. Absolutely.
Can you explain the biology about why decomposition use up oxygen in the water?
Yeah, so bacteria are really what's doing the decomposition, and that process is what is using up oxygen. It's also called respiration. So it's kind of like the opposite of photosynthesis in a chemical sense. So it's using up oxygen in the process of decomposition.
And Bea have a question. If the water the oysters filter is polluted with man-made chemicals, how do the oyster handle that?
That's a really great question, and something I actually try to bring up, so I'm glad that I was reminded of it. So oysters are, considered filters, but I definitely like to emphasize to people that they're not like our kind of singular solution to water quality issues, because water quality can mean a bunch of different things. There are a lot of different issues that impact water quality. So if you have like toxins or chemicals in the water, they can certainly harm oysters. Like I said, that was kind of one of the reasons degradations in water quality contributed to their decline initially. So they're not going to solve all of our problems if we do not take care of our waterways in other ways, and make sure that we are aware of the other water quality issues that, and challenges that water bodies like Hempstead Harbor might face. The oysters won't even survive. They won't be able to do the filtering that they do. Yeah, the toxins or anything that you might be referring to would end up in their tissues, and would harm them. So it could shorten their lifespan. Yeah, it could inhibit their ability to perform normal functions like feeding and reproducing, depending on what the actual chemical is. So we definitely need to pay attention on a broader scale. Oysters we're just not throwing them in there and hoping that they solve all of our problems. It definitely has to be put in context. But that's a great question.
So in terms of restoration, you are purposely putting the oyster back in a certain area. Is that the hope to establish the oyster reef that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think since we're only a few years old, that goal is still being kind of assessed as far as getting to like an oyster, what would be considered an oyster reef. What we really would love to do is just to increase the density overall and increase their numbers. And then we will, like I said, continue to monitor and see what is kind of viable with the amount of oysters that we can be adding every year. Kind of relates to what you were saying before. If they have a higher density and if there are enough hard surfaces around, when the ones that we do put into the water are mature enough to spawn, the hope is that they will have kind of each other to settle on, and then eventually you would get something resembling a reef. But I can't say with any certainty like when that would happen. That's not one of our specific goals at the moment, as far as imagining when it could happen. It does take time. 60,000 oysters and 75,000, it sounds like a lot, but it will take years for that to happen realistically.
I think in the past the eastern coast was called the oyster capital of the world at one point, and I think
Where it was
now is about 90 or 95% was gone at this point. So yes, it is a long road.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
In terms of oyster for consumption, what should one know about human consumption of oysters?
So you shouldn't be worried about that, as everyone can assess their own risk, but the oysters that are removed and harvested for consumption are only allowed to be grown in areas that pass certain certification standards. That's for bacteria. So water quality is assessed in a really stringent way where people farm oysters. So that's like I said, everyone can assess their own risk, but it's definitely I wouldn't worry about that too much. I guess it's hard for me to I feel like I'm giving advice I shouldn't be, but just be aware that when people farm them, there are a lot of regulations in place for what oysters that actually get to be consumed are.
I guess it's the same as a organic garden.
Right. You just be aware of the source, but people are very aware of that issue.
Can you repeat the name of the yacht club where the volunteers tend to the garden?
So Sea Cliff Yacht Club is one of our sites. Yeah. And we also have the Hempstead Harbor Club. I don't know which one they were referring to, but
we could find that information on the website, correct?
Yeah.
And what are your biggest challenges?
That's a good question too. I wouldn't say it's a challenge, because I think it really, brings out the best in our program, but just stretching for time and capacity. I think like we all, every staff member like contributes so much to this program, and just like, yeah, I mean, you just get stretched for like time and energy. That's a big challenge. We're dealing with, like, when we had to release the oysters just last week, like I said, we did it over the course of 2 days. It's just a few of us and some volunteers doing it. So we, yeah, it takes a lot of energy and organizing to do the work. But I don't know. I guess that's not like, it's a challenge, but it's not one that's unwelcome. And I'm trying to think if we have other specific ones I can think of. I don't know, I think sometimes the setups can be challenging. So like each site we deal with a different landscape a little bit. So a lot of times the oysters are strung alongside a dock. That's most convenient for us to take them in and out of the water. But that comes with its own challenges. We have to sometimes make little amendments to how things are set up. And yeah, so it can be tricky if things go awry. We're constantly kind of figuring out the best way to make sure the oysters are always just floating in the water, staying in a line. There are little technical challenges like that come up throughout the season, I guess.
So
I'll type the name, yeah, the clubs and of the locations in the chat just in case people can't find it later.
Okay.
So and I'll answer other questions.
Yes, there are others. Like Gloria still wants to know, does the stormy weather impact the oysters? Especially
wait, I need to find the question. Stormy weather. Oh, yeah. So luckily we had them out before this last week, but like rain and regular precipitation, not a problem. No issues. We had pretty bad storms, and I guess that was a couple weeks ago now. And like I said, that can sometimes interfere with the stability of the setup. Sometimes I get a little worried about it, but we've done a good job, I think, making sure everything is always secure. But the rain, like precipitation, like storminess itself doesn't affect them.
Do you have any plans for the South Shore? Any programs to go that way?
So we will just be operating in Hempstead Harbor. We don't have any plans for any South Shore work. There are like programs, restoration programs that operate all over Long Island, but yeah, our program is specifically for Hempstead Harbor. That's what we have the ability to do.
And in terms of volunteers, what is your most effective way to reach out for volunteers? Are you still asking or looking for volunteers? And how can we help? How can an individual help?
Absolutely. So every year we do outreach kind of all over again. So like this year we had repeat volunteers, people who did it last year and wanted to join in again, who kind of were already aware about the program. But we always find more people who don't know, about the work and want to get involved. So I think one of our main ways is through our general email list, where we kind of put out information about our work periodically anyway. We will put out an announcement before the season begins, before anyone has to sign up, letting them know that the season's starting up again, and letting them know how to sign up to volunteer. Usually it's through like a Google form, and then I follow up and contact anyone who's signed up. So I would say one of the best ways if you want to, be contacted about it as a volunteer would be to sign up for our email list. And also just being aware that it starts, the program starts to gear up in June and July, and you should, if you wanted to participate, you could be on the lookout for signups around probably like May. So yeah, I would say being, keeping up with our social media and website and joining our email list would be great ways that's how we typically gather volunteers.
That's great. Thank you, Martha. Is anybody else have questions for Martha?
Yeah, I think I saw one more from Bayer. I guess it's just a comment, funding as a challenge. And yeah, definitely. I think Coalition, like I said, broadly is very much supported by community efforts and community financial funding. So as we develop this program, we're continually exploring avenues for funding, but always community member contributions are helpful, and they contribute directly to us being able to get the equipment that we need and contribute to the time and the hours that it takes to get projects like this done. So we definitely accept community support. But like I said, we are continuing to explore, avenues of funding as we expand our program.
Thank you, Martha.
Thank you,
And
guys.
hopefully we'll be able to see the program grow in the future and have more cooperation with our students in
Absolutely. Yeah.
summer program. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you, guys. I
everybody
appreciate it.
to
Thank you for listening.
joining us.